God gave me two standards that we need to look at. One is Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, you're working in vain. This is, you're laboring. This is God's work. He is at work redeeming the world. He's calling people to himself. He has a plan. But for his own purposes, his plan is to work through us.
Hi, you're listening to the Zan Tyler podcast. When my family started our homeschooling journey, there were so many decisions to make, but one of our best decisions was choosing to use BJU Press Homeschool. I've never seen my kids so excited to get textbooks before. I'm amazed by how interesting and interactive the lessons are. My kids actually look forward to them. We use the online video lessons for all our courses, but I know some families choose to teach from the textbooks. What I love is that I can trust BJU Press to uphold our values. The Bible and biblical principles are woven throughout each subject. I'll admit, I was a bit nervous when I started homeschooling, but I've found a wonderful online community of other BJU Press homeschool families and consultants. The Homeschool Hub also makes my job easier. I can set up our schedules and rearrange them with just a few clicks. On the dashboard, I can see each of my kids' progress, and the assignments page shows me quickly what's ready for me to check or grade. I'm glad my son's biology assignments are automatically graded. BJU Press Homeschool has given us the tools and confidence to homeschool our children. For more information, do what I did and visit the BJU Press Homeschool website or talk with your local HomeWorks consultant. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Zan Tyler podcast, where our goal is to help you thrive on your homeschooling journey. Let me just take a minute to ask you to please subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen. And if the podcast has been encouraging to you, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Each review really does help us. We're available on YouTube now, and be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, where we have even more content and some great reels. We have a great podcast for you today. My close friend, Tammy Wood, will be sharing her 30-year homeschool adventure with us, which includes 5 international adoptions. In all, the Woods have 7 children. The Bible tells us to look after orphans and widows in their distress. And today we will talk about what that looks like in Tammy's life and how that can encourage us in our own. So welcome, Tammy. Thanks so much for being here. Welcome, everybody. Today, I am so thrilled to have one of my dearest friends with us. She lives around the corner, if you can call it around the corner in the country. But we've been neighbors for over 20 years, and that's been a lot of fun. We've homeschooled our children together. And so I just want to introduce you to Tammy Wood. Tammy, thank you so much for coming over today.
Absolutely.
So we're having a lot of fun because we're doing this in person.
Yeah.
And so we don't always get to see each other a lot with both of our crazy schedules. So, Tammy, I want you to tell me about how many children you have and how you and Bill got into homeschooling to begin with.
We have 7 children, and we got into homeschooling sort of, I don't know. Catherine was a very young, her birthday's in mid-August, so she was going to be a very young kindergartner. She, even as an adult, is someone who needs a lot of sleep, and she was still really napping a lot. So back in the day, this was in the 90s, like 92, you either got slated for morning kindergarten or afternoon kindergarten. And she got afternoon. So I went to my local school and I said, oh, this is not going to work. She's going to be too tired. She's used to napping, blah, blah. And they said, well, too bad for you. And I said, I honestly kind of begged. I'll take her. I'll do whatever. But
right.
You
really didn't need the bus. Yeah.
I need a morning slot. And they're like, no. So I just said, well, then I'll homeschool. And the principal said, you can't do that. And I'm like, oh, yes, I can. And, God kind of used
those were the wrong words to tell you.
Oh, no, God used that stubborn streak that is, he knows that I have. And so he's like, you can't do that. Like, yes, I can. And so he said, well, if you do, you have to sign a waiver that absolves us of all responsibility for her education. I said, I'll do that right this minute. So I signed that thing, went home and said, guess what, Bill? And he is such a trooper. He's just wonderful. But so it was really a blessing. I did not know until later. I went back and looked. So this was in 92. I didn't realize that SCAES had only come into being like in 1990 or
Right.
something like
And
that.
we weren't legal until 1992.
Well, but that's why, I knew about that. And so I had the courage, and I knew my rights. I could certainly homeschool. You need to get up with the times. So anyway, so I thought, who can mess up kindergarten? So we started with kindergarten.
Yeah, that's what Joe said to me too. Who can mess up kindergarten? I think that's how a lot of COVID moms felt. Like, well, we can't mess up any more than we're seeing on these virtual classes right now. Right. Yeah.
And I thought, well, it can't be worse than her being so grumpy and half asleep, so let's just do what we do. And there you go. I was going to homeschool for kindergarten, and then I was going to homeschool for a couple more years. And then I finished up 30 years last fall. This spring.
Yeah, 30 years. That's pretty hardcore. That is unbelievable. Yeah. So when you just started out of the blue like that, I mean, we have a lot of people who came into COVID never knowing they would homeschool, but we also have a lot of people now. I met somebody at the last convention I went to that just had babies, but they were preparing for homeschooling. So did you feel overwhelmed not being prepared at the beginning, or were you just very, just knew that the Lord had led you to do that?
I think it was part of that. Just knowing that God had led us, and I can look back and see how he had prepared me. Part of that preparation was that I do have a master's degree in library science. And so there's that mindset was, I may not know everything, but I know where to find it.
Yeah.
And so, like, well, I'll just go out and find out what I need to know. The other thing was Catherine is one of these natural students. And so teaching her was easy. She was asking to be taught. She wanted to learn to read. So basically going to the library and getting some good books back in the day, that was the beginning.
So let's fast forward to her senior year. Did she have a perfect score on the SAT?
No, she didn't really. I don't think she had a perfect score on the math part.
But she had a perfect score
on the English or writing
or whatever it's called. Yeah, writing and isn't that terrible? I can't remember what it's called now either. But the first part of the SAT, she had an 800 on.
But that is more of a testimony to her diligence and her natural need to know. Need to know everything. So, and then Lucinda, who's 2 years younger, but 3 years with grade wise, came along. And she was a totally different bird. She had a need to have fun.
Yes, she did. She still does. I love that about Lucinda.
So, but as we went along, we realized later through God's grace that she was severely dyslexic, and she also really struggles with asthma, and those two together I think would have been really hard to be in a public school. Just asthma comes with all the allergies and just little sicknesses. Small little colds can turn into pneumonia quick. And so just the opportunity to have her at home. And then we had the opportunity then to get her tested and to realize that she was dyslexic, and then to move from there. So it was a perfect fit, and God knew that, but we didn't know that way back when.
For both girls, for totally different reasons.
Totally different reasons, yeah.
So what kept you homeschooling all the way through high school?
Well, I actually sent Catherine to school 1 year at a local Christian private school. It's a wonderful school, but she came home one day and she said, because Catherine was born an old soul, and she said, "Mom, can I wait until I'm older to have ulcers and just come back and be homeschooled?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know." I said, "Just the whole idea just scared me so bad."
Of homeschooling in high school.
Homeschooling in high school, because that's there's just certain things I knew I was not competent in.
Right.
Foreign language, science, what do you do? So, but she had a vision, and she said, "I will do whatever if you will just let me homeschool for high school. So at that point, I moved more into a time manager and a resource person
Mm-hmm.
than an actual teacher. Now, I did teach some things, but I put my research knowledge, in,
Yeah.
and like
Mm-hmm.
started looking into what resources she needed. And I let her help me. What do you want to learn? So back then she wanted to learn German. Well, it wasn't easy. So we sent off to the University of Nebraska that sent us little cassette tapes that had German on it. And then they sent little workbooks, and it was all through the University of Nebraska, but she was able to do German through that program.
Mm-hmm.
And then she studied German in college. I mean,
She did. So that was just
Mhm.
really, for some reason, a passion of hers.
It really was. Well, my mother, her heritage is German, and
Okay.
so she
I
just
didn't
thought
know
that
that.
sounded
Yeah.
really cool.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Bill studied German in high school, so it sort of set the pace. But that's what she wanted to do. So even back then, um, a little bit of research, and you could find anything you needed to do what you wanted to do.
Even in the
Mm-hmm.
90s, that's right. And
Yeah.
so I guess our girls graduated in 2005 from high school together.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say. So what? So you started homeschooling because Catherine would get so tired. So what, as you continued homeschooling, what became your vision or your reasons for homeschooling?
Partly when we discovered that Lucinda was dyslexic.
Mm-hmm.
She really had a vision for being with her friends. I just want to go do something fun. So she and I made a deal, and I said, if you will let me work with your education
Mm-hmm.
so that we can focus on that,
Mm-hmm.
because I felt like that I wanted to make sure that she didn't get discouraged, and she didn't always feel like I'm behind, I'm not smart,
Right. Yeah.
et cetera,
Yeah.
et cetera. That happens when you're in a group and you're the one that's not making the strides, like
That's
at the same pace that everyone
And
else is.
not to interrupt you, but fast forwarding, she became a teacher.
For that reason, she said, I know what it feels like to be a special ed kid. I know what it feels like to be working as hard as everyone else, but not making the same strides as everyone else, the same gains. It doesn't look the same. So homeschooling gave us the flexibility. She didn't do her own writing, like papers and things. She would dictate, and I would write down what she wanted to say, to way out in high school. It gave us the flexibility to just work around her strengths and to give her accommodations for the things that were difficult for her. But I told her, I said, you let me help you with your education, and I will make sure you have fun.
And that's a pretty good deal.
Well, and so then that gave me I knew I needed to go out and find some fun things. So I started some homeschooling groups.
That's right. You started our support group out in this area.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was like, Lucinda would have some friends, and she wanted to do things with people. But it was fun, and there was always I usually plan like 2 years. And so, but it gave me there was always something else I wanted to do. Oh, we wanted to do that group activity. We wanted to do that field trip. We didn't get it to it this year. We want to study this. It'd be easier if we did that at home. So, God didn't throw it all at me at one time. That would have been overwhelming. But I could break it off in little chunks. Right. And then I had a vision.
If God had said to you when you started homeschooling, Catherine, and this was going to last for 30 years, by the way.
That's right. Yeah, right. So, God is gracious. He knew he knew what would push me forward, which was I wanted both of my children to feel successful and to do what I knew that their potential was, but it may not look the same as everybody else's journey. So, and then, anyway, so that's how we got started. And I always had this like 2-year vision, 2 years. Oh, we got to do this, got to do that. And there you go. The rest is history.
Okay. So you had 2 girls. Tell us how that morphed into 30 years with only having the 2 girls.
Right.
What happened next in the Wood family?
Well, part of my vision was having my girls. I enjoyed having them with me. And so I took them with me almost everywhere. And at one point at our church, we had a lady who, this was in this was in the early 90s when China first started opening up and letting the United people from the U.S. come in. It was a real change in paradigm for that, those foreign relations.
Yeah, right.
And a friend of ours from our church went. She had a medical degree, and so she was able to get into some of these orphanages. She came back. In China. Yes. She went to China. She came back, and this was before PowerPoint, she did a slideshow, and she talked about them. And so Lucinda was 5, and she was with me in that meeting when they were talking about the needs of these kids. And she looks at me and she says, "Mommy, you must go to China and get 22 of those children." And I've often said, "Why 22?" And she's like, "At 5 years old, that sounded like a perfectly round number to me. What's the big deal?" So, in my own faith way, I said, "No, I'm not doing that." I told her, and I said, "Honey, Mommy's not doing that." So she's like, "Yes, that's what you need to do." So, and I tell parents, be careful, because Fabian's last words, if you really feel like that's what I need to do, you just need to pray about that. And she took that seriously, and she began to pray, and she enlisted the help of Catherine, who was 7, and they prayed and prayed and prayed, and they were not nice about it at all. Now, in God's providence, we had been financing a local Christian ministry, and they had, as part of their, they sent out a quarterly magazine. In that magazine, they had what they called Children of Promise. These were children that were available for adoption all over the world, and some in the United States, but a lot of international adoptions. So they would cut out little pictures and put them on my refrigerator and leave me notes and say, "Mommy, can you really resist this face? Mommy, we think she looks just like you. Mommy, can't you picture this child in our family?" I kid you not. It was a real passion.
I have known you for so long, and I never knew that part of the story. It is amazing when kids start praying.
Yes.
It's like we can't just think, "Oh, they're kids." I mean,
right. Yeah, that is exactly right. And so, it's all about like my heart. They were 15 and 13 before we went to China, so it wasn't like
this was like an 8-year process. Yes,
and they were relentless. So anyway, the Lord really began to lay it on my heart, and at one point, I just knew, and so when I just knew, I said to the Lord, "That's fine, but you need to tell Bill I am not." So one night, Bill said, "The girls keep talking about international adoption. What do you really think about it?" I'm like, "Well, let me tell you, I really feel like that this is what we need to do." And he said, "Call tomorrow. We're in." So that began the process, and goodness, God really showed up in a big way. And it wasn't that it wasn't difficult, but
so let's give the end before we give the journey. So how many Chinese children did y'all end up adopting?
We adopted 2. Rebecca and Beth are both, they're from mainland China. And then we adopted 3 who were a sibling set from Taiwan.
Okay. And what years were those adoptions, Tammy?
Okay, so we adopted Rebecca. We brought her home in 2003.
And she was how old?
13 months.
13 months, okay.
And then 2 years later, so 2005. So the year that Catherine graduated, we brought Beth home, and she was 16 months.
Okay.
So just slightly behind Rebecca.
Okay, and then tell us, because I remember we had a shower for... It was, okay, who was first, Beth or Becca?
Rebecca.
Okay.
Yes.
I've got the pictures I came across the other day that I have promptly lost again. I have got to do a good job with my non-digital pictures. But then, so how long was it between Beth and the when you got Hannah, Claire, and Will?
Will, Hannah, and Claire. So Rebecca was 9 and Beth was 7.
Okay.
So quite a few years. And we were still supporting the same group at that point, and they had their Children of Promise. They had a sibling set, and it just said from Asia. And we knew that typically in China, you can't get sibling sets just because of the way their system works. And so I called my social worker and said, "A sibling set from, where are they?" And she said, "Well, Taiwan." And she said, "Taiwanese adoptions are much more Western. Taiwan is a much more Western country. They have a whole foster care system. It's just different, very different.
Right.
And so they do keep sibling sets together. And so we kept asking questions, and Bill said, "Are we going to curious ourselves into 3 more children?" I'm like, yes, I think we But honestly, there were weeks and months of fasting and prayer. It wasn't just a jump into. But God really laid these kids on our hearts, and we really felt like they were ours. So we began to just ask questions, and the orphanage asked us questions, and we asked them questions. And going into it, we had some real strikes against us. I was 48. Bill was 48 too, but my birthday's a little before his. So once you turn 50, international adoption's almost unheard of.
Okay.
Bill had a heart attack about 3 years before, and you have to be at least 5 years out of what they call a major health crisis. And we already have 4 children. That is a huge family in the Asian world. Right. And so they thought, you do not need more kids. And we didn't have enough money. I mean, as far as their standards went, how much cushion they expected you to have. Right. So adopting 3 at one time, they expected a big cushion. They were like, you cannot afford this. And, we just were like, well, we just kept pursuing it, and God kept opening the doors, and the whole process took 9 months. Now,
whoa,
that is unheard of in international adoption. Today, it totally, but even back then, more like 36 months, 2 years was more the norm.
Right.
But you just know that this was God. This was God moving this forward. And these children at that time were 11, 9, and 6. And he had a plan for them, and he moved it forward and brought them into our family. And,
so how old were when Will, Claire, and Hannah came home? How old were Beth, Becca, Catherine, and Lucinda?
Oh gracious, I'm not sure how old Catherine and Lucinda were. They were already, Catherine was already a professional out of college working in Charlotte. And this is where you see God's hand in it. She was working in Charlotte through Teach for America as a ESL, or English as a second language teacher. God moved her back home into my house. I had a professional teacher who was trained as an ESL teacher when I had 3 students who did not speak English. Then Lucinda, she had already graduated. Well, she graduated from college maybe that year. I don't know. It was soon.
Right.
She was living in Charleston, working in a charter special school. And God moved her back home. And Will is our special needs child. And so I had a special needs teacher, professional with experience, living in my home, who not only had this experience and knowledge, but they had a heart love for these children. And they didn't teach; they had to go get jobs.
Right.
We weren't supporting all these people, but they were giving me advice and help and encouragement. I mean, imagine that.
That really is amazing to behold the way the Lord works. And so you didn't put any of the adopted children in school either.
No, and there again, I had been homeschooling at this point so long,
right,
that it was our family lifestyle.
Right.
It was our family rhythm. And so to have 3 children, an 11-year-old boy who had special needs, no English skills, no knowledge of Western, like they had never lived in a functioning family or had any knowledge of how Western countries worked.
Or really had enough food to eat, or
just so many things, that God. And then we were still working through SCAES at that point, and they were so gracious. They gave us lots of advice, lots of help, lots of encouragement, but really about 3 years before we made academic gains. And, that could have really been a big discouragement for me.
Right.
And scary to think, oh, how are we ever gonna be ready, for adulthood.
So let me just say this. We keep using the word SCAES. And so for those of you who have listened to the podcast from the beginning, you know that that's an organization that Joe and I started in 1990. And we were involved in lawsuits, and we finally got legal clearance from the state legislature in 1992 to operate. And it's a full support system for homeschooling parents. And so Bill is actually on the board now. He's a wonderful attorney and has just been a huge help to us. And so that's SCAES. But so when you say that SCAES supported you, we also have the special needs segment as well as department, as well as high school and elementary. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, if you feel comfortable doing this, tell us the story about taking Will to the orthodontist and what you discovered that day.
Right. Well, he was having such a difficult time. He had severe articulation issues.
And he's 11.
Right.
Okay.
So, but at this point, he's been in speech. He's getting close to 12. And it doesn't seem like we're making any difference. So I just didn't know. I was getting pretty desperate. So I took him to my orthodontist, who was a wonderful friend from my church, and said, would you just look at him? Is there anything structurally about his jaw, his tongue? Can you see any reason why he cannot articulate? And so he took all of these x-rays, which he did not charge me for at all for any of the kids. And he said, no, structurally he's good. But he said, do you realize there's a metal ball in his ear? And well, no. So I took him to my other friend who goes to my church. I tell you, I cannot, it would be another whole podcast of how many people came alongside me. So I don't want anyone listening to this to think, wow, that woman was great. All the stuff she did. I had so many people, not only my 2 adult daughters coming alongside me, but so many people who came alongside.
But Tammy, you didn't know you would have all that when you committed to adopt the 3. It's like you moved in faith and the Lord met your faith exceedingly abundantly, all that you could ever ask or think.
Right. With people that just came alongside. So this friend who is a professional ENT, I said, would you look at his ears? There's something in his ears. So he began to clean out his ears with a teeny little vacuum cleaner. Both ears were totally stuffed with debris, airsoft pellets, pieces of broken pencil, metal balls. It's just stuff. And all I can say is he came from a home background of deprivation and neglect, is what they say. And we both know that even when you're looking at your child, they can find that one Cheerio that you didn't, vacuum up. And so you think about a child that no one's really paying attention to, all the things on the floor they can get into. He's a kid, stuck it in his ears.
So he was basically deaf at that point.
Yes. And so then when we began to realize that and analyze his speech is much more like a deaf person trying to talk by just watching you move your mouth.
Interesting. I remember what you told me when he walked outside after having his ears cleared out.
Yes. So he cleared out his ears, and Will said, the birds are loud.
But so the things he hadn't been hearing.
Right. And but he had no damage to his ears. All that stuff. And his ears were perfectly healthy. And his hearing is perfectly healthy. That God had preserved that all these years. So then we began speech again. And in that, I also had other professionals come alongside me who did piano lessons that helped with the hearing, and singing lessons, all these things that helped him with articulation and voicing and just self-esteem, just ways that people came alongside us and encouraged him.
Well, so what would you tell people about adoption today? People who are thinking about it, praying about it, or like you and have never thought about it. What would you say about adoption?
First of all, I really feel like that God gave me 2 like standards that we need to look at. One is Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, you're working in vain. This is, you're laboring. This is God's work. He is at work redeeming the world. He's calling people to himself. He has a plan. But for his own purposes, his plan is to work through us. So we felt called to adopt these 3 kids. And be honest, there were a lot of people who were not enthusiastic about
Oh, you had very little support. I remember this because I remember praying with you. There were just people people thought you were crazy for adopting a sibling set of 3 after you already had 4 children.
Right. And, why are you doing this? What are you, it really was the idea. What are you trying to prove? What are you trying to accomplish? I had one person say to me, do you understand that older children have issues? Actually, we all have issues. It just, but so I asked the Lord at one point, this is your plan. Tell me again, why am I doing this? What really are you trying to accomplish? And the Lord's, I felt like, said, first of all, it's easier to tell you what you are not doing. What you are not doing is saving anybody. There is a savior of the world. It is not you. You are not rescuing these children. And God assured me that he is sovereign. He is sovereign over the whole world, and that people don't go to heaven because they speak English, because they have a good education, because they have good health care. They go to heaven because God, the Holy Spirit, works in their life. And he can do that anywhere, anytime, in any circumstance. He doesn't need me to intervene so that this happens. But that it is for his own glory and for his own purposes. Children reach their full potential best when they're in a family situation. And so what he was calling me to do was to be the mom. And I had been a mom for years. This was something I had experience in. I had a vision for. I sort of knew what it looked like. So that's what I needed to do. That was a doable job.
Right.
And so God said, that's what I want you to do, to be the mom. So Psalm 127, unless the Lord builds the house. So if he's building this house, then he's going to, I don't have to.
That's right. They labor in vain who build it. But when you're doing it with him, it's this joint venture with God. And I just think that's the beauty of adoption. Then we see what he did for us in adopting us through Christ in such a precious, special way.
Right. And the other scriptures where he talks about when people are coming before him, it's at the end, and he says, oh, I know you were the ones who brought me a cup of cold water when I was, in prison, or visited me in prison, or brought me, when I was needy. And they're like, when did I do that? And he said, when you do it to the least of these. And so when we look, God doesn't call us to these huge, huge events that seem overwhelming. It's just do that thing, do that next thing. Supply clean dishes and clean clothes and a warm, meal and home, and then the next thing. And God was gracious in making that happen. So,
well, there's that verse. I can remember when Joe and I first started homeschooling, the one thing I wanted for my kids is that they had a servant heart. And I went to so many organizations to see if we could volunteer together, but the boys are 4 and 6. Nobody knew about homeschooling. And they would say, Miss Tyler, go put your kids in school, and we'd love to have you volunteer. And so, the cry of my heart is, Lord, how can I teach them to serve if we can't serve together?
Right.
And so the verse the Lord gave me, and I know that you've talked about this a lot, is James 1:27, that pure and undefiled religion is this, that we look after orphans and widows in their distress. And so for us, it was a ministry to widows for many, many years as a family. For you, it's probably been both, because I know you've cared for a lot of parents, you've cared for people in your church, and then you took in orphans. It's so funny to call your kids orphans because they're not. But you took them in when they needed, when they were in their distress.
Right, when they were orphans.
Yes, that's right, and in distress. And so I just think homeschooling is such a great tool for service, because you do it as a family. You teach children. I mean, the lessons Catherine and Lucinda learned as y'all are going through this, to pray, first of all,
Right.
and then to serve. And then your children, the ones who were adopted, the things they've learned. And they're amazing children, amazing adults in their own right. So you've graduated now, all of them from high school.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is pretty amazing. Thanks again for joining us today for this important discussion. I hope you'll make sure to join us next week as we conclude the conversation with my dear friend Tammy about all things homeschooling, teaching kids with special needs, and also the importance of service and adoption in our homeschooling. Until next week, we'll see you then. Bye.